welcome to episode 98 of the CRICKETher Weekly. Yes, it's been a week, hasn't it, Raf? We're just coming off the back of the women's test in the Ashes, which was played for the last 4 days overnight on English time, which means that we were going to bed about 6 or 7 in the evening, getting up again at 11 in the evening, so that was our morning, and then doing the night shift, and then working our day jobs during the day, which was particularly crazy. How are you feeling, Raf?
I feel utterly shattered. As you say, we've basically been nocturnal and trying to do our day jobs as well, and I just want to go to bed and sleep for 100 years. I don't even know how the players must be feeling, because I feel totally emotionally wrung out as well, having watched that final session where it really looked like England were going to pull off the miracle, and then suddenly they didn't, and then suddenly they had to, the last few overs, they had to cling on for the draw, and I couldn't quite work out what was happening, and because of it being the end of kind of 4 totally broken nights of sleep, and it also happening several thousand miles away, it really doesn't feel quite real. So if you are watching or listening to this, did it really happen?
Well, I think it did, but it was a strange day in many ways, wasn't it? So this time yesterday, we were thinking that it was almost guaranteed to be a draw. We'd lost 2 entire sessions to rain, and yet Australia came out. They put on a few more runs. They opened up a little bit, not as much as England did later, but they did in the end declare, and left England something that they could chase, and England had a good go at chasing it. Were you surprised at the way it all went, Raf?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I fessed that up in my 4th day piece on CRICKETher today. Basically, comeback Meg Lanning, all is forgiven, in the sense of Taunton 2019, when she really was quite negative, and famously Matthew Mott said, "We're not a charity and we didn't have to give England any sniff at it." Well, on this occasion today, she did decide to give England a sniff at it. Not much of one, admittedly, because I do think that there was a general sense in which everyone really, including us, was saying this is totally unlikely, and really England have got like a 0.01% chance of pulling this off, because they would have to bat at 5.5 and over for these 40 overs, and that's just so unlikely to happen that it might as well, it's a very minuscule carrot that Meg Lanning has dangled, but she did dangle it, and I really got that wrong, because yesterday I tweeted saying there's not a snowball's chance in hell that Meg Lanning will declare. So egg on my face.
You weren't the only one thinking that there, Raf. That there were a couple of journalists that still thought that, and plenty of people on Twitter still thought that.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Well, because we were going on the evidence of what had happened a couple of years ago, and I do think that was relevant, because there are so few women's tests that when something has happened relatively recently that's similar, then you kind of have to look back to that as your precedent. But I did ask Meg Lanning actually about this in the post-match press conference. I said, was the flack that you received after Taunton, did that influence your decision to dangle a very small carrot in front of England today? And she totally denied it and said, no, it didn't. We'd already set our plans before we came into the match, and today's declaration, we very much did it on our terms. Now that may be true, but I can't help but think that there may be a little bit of her that will have been aware of the criticism last time, and that will have influenced her decision to do differently today. So I was quite surprised, but good on her. Respect Meg Lanning.
Okay.
So Sid, we've had 4 days of a really exciting women's Ashes test. What have we learned? What are you going to take away from these 4 days, other than the fact that we shouldn't ever try to deprive ourselves of sleep?
Well, I think the key thing that I've learned, or perhaps relearned, is that declaration cricket is a game of risk, and it's an art form, and it's something that you need to kind of think about a bit more carefully, and it is an extra element to the game. It's very, very interesting that when I was growing up, back in ye olden days, declaration cricket was played much more than it is now. So at school, I played declaration cricket.
Ooh, did you?
We did, yes. 2020 was yet a twinkle in the eyes of the ICC and cricket's administrators, and we played declaration cricket. And if you could, the captain could put themselves in, they could, and there was nothing to stop them batting all day. And not giving the opposition even a chance of a bat. Of course, the master in charge might start prodding you in the ribs if you did that. But technically, there was nothing to do that. And clubs as well. So and even women's clubs did play declaration cricket. But ultimately, we've kind of lost that art. And women's clubs nowadays never play declaration cricket. I don't know whether men's clubs still do. Perhaps you guys out there can let us know. We don't follow men's club cricket at all.
Yeah, I think it's much less common in the days of limited overs cricket, isn't it?
Yeah, and limited overs cricket does solve some problems with declaration cricket. It does guarantee you a result, and it does kind of force you out of that potentially negative mindset where you don't want to take risks. But what we've learned from this test is that it's an art, and if you play the game right, if you time your declaration right, that's part of the skill of it. Part of of what makes cricket such a smart game. And declaration cricket in particular is that you have to time the thing right, and you have to think it, and you have to outthink the opposition captain, and there's mind games going on and all this stuff. And it's a bit odd really, because that's the kind of thing, mind games is something that Meg Lanning and Matthew Mott definitely do think a lot about. I mean,
yeah.
we've just finished reading Alex Blackwell's autobiography, and that kind of gives you a bit of an inside track on some of that stuff, and yet they've been resistant to it, and they've been very reluctant to take the risks that you need to take. But now they have, and I hope that other people have learned as well. I think there's a really good chance that the next Australia captain, whoever she is, whether she's Hannah Darlington or anyone else, she was there today. Hannah Darlington was sitting on the bench. She obviously wasn't directly involved in the game, but she was kind of one of the 12ths. And England's next captain, there's a good chance she was there as well. Albeit, whether that's Charlie Dean or Sophia Dunkley or whoever. And I hope they've learned those lessons as well and can take them forward into a future where we can really, provide exciting tests ongoing. What about you, Raf? What have you learned?
I'm afraid this is going to be a bit controversial because I tweeted it during the test, and there was quite a lot of comeback. But I think that what we're seeing is that actually all of the talk before this test was that Elise Perry is the test superstar, the test wonder kid. She's not so much a kid anymore, but anyway, she was the one that everyone was like, right, we really prize her wicket, and she's the best test player in the world. Well, I think that we've learned that the best test player in the world is Heather Knight. It's not Elise Perry anymore. Sorry kids, sorry folks, because I know that Elise Perry has achieved a huge amount for women's cricket, and certainly has in the past been the best test player in the world. But I think that as far as this test goes, what we're seeing is that Heather Knight is a better test batter than Elise Perry. So yeah, sorry if that's controversial, but that's what I think.
Yeah, and Heather Knight's not done, is she? How long can Heather Knight go on? Because she's at the peak of her powers in this, and batters can go on a long time. Maybe she is going to carry on for another 5 or 6 years on the strength of these kinds of performances. I mean, it's definitely one of the performances of her career, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be the case that as well that when she steps down from the captaincy that she retires, for example. I feel a little bit sheepish because I know that a few weeks ago on this CRICKETher Weekly, I actually said, oh well, if England lose the Ashes and then the World Cup, maybe Heather Knight won't retain the captaincy. I think that on the strength of this test performance, that is no longer, her position is no longer up for threat because she just was so brilliant. And I don't think it should be.
She's banked a huge amount of credit, hasn't she?
Yeah, quite rightly. She was just, she gave it absolutely everything. And I think that she just, performed so brilliantly. So well done to her. So I guess that's kind of what I've learned.
Okay. Now, a lot of the talk, around the test has been about, should there be 5-day tests? It's kind of putting it in historical perspective, Raf. 4-day tests are actually a comparatively new thing. And originally, for many years, women's tests were only 3 days. Why was that?
Yeah, well, when they first started playing women's tests in 1934-35, England v Australia, I think that ultimately it came down to it being a money thing. So 3 days was the way in which you could have a test and it to be much less costly. And this, this was at a time when women's cricket was being run and organised by totally amateur women's associations. They had to raise all of the funds to play Test cricket themselves. So obviously you play across 3 days. I think that there was also a sense in which, in a kind of amateur era, when you might perhaps say that there was a bit less at stake, kind of reputationally and financially. I'm not saying that the matches weren't really hard fought, but in an amateur era there was certainly, I think there was a lot more appetite for competitive, aggressive declarations, and actually it was a bit of a point of pride that you really did declare in a way that was seen to be sporting enough, that you did give your opponent a kind of bite at the cherry, or dangling the carrot. So yeah, that was why there were initially 3 days. And then interestingly, we actually, by the 1970s, when there's been a significant amount of draws, because even by that time people were slightly losing their appetite for aggressive declarations, it's the Australians who really pushed for the introduction of 4-day tests, and England really resisted. And some of the conversations that were had mirror the ones that we've been having recently about women's tests, in the sense of the English were saying, oh well, it's all about mindset, and you should just play more aggressively, and be willing to declare, a bit like what you were saying about declaration cricket. And they were basically like, that's the name of the game. Why should we introduce another day? And also there were concerns about why we can't really afford it, and we're going to end up having to play less tests if you're going to force them to be 4 days duration. So what did Australia do? Well, they went off and played 4-day tests against New Zealand, and eventually England were like, okay, we better get on board with this, and they slightly changed their mind. So there's a to some extent there's a kind of generational shift that takes place in the 70s. But yeah, it's quite interesting to look back and think that some of the debates are similar.
And tell us, Raf, because what's the case now? Could the boards just decide to play a 5-day test if they wanted to? What's the deal there?
I thought that they could, actually. I've learned something. We were talking about what we've learned. I have learned that there are actually...
something you didn't know, Raf.
I know. Mind blown. I've learned that there are ICC playing conditions that govern women's Test cricket nowadays, and that those playing conditions actually officially dictate that there can only be play on 4 days. Now, they do say you can have a reserve day, but you can only play on the reserve day if there hasn't been play on one of your previous 4 days. So if we'd had a reserve day for this test, we wouldn't have been able to use it, because they did get one session on day 3.
So even if there was only one over bowled.
And so that's actually a bit useless, isn't it? What a useless thing. Anyway, sorry, I've just accused the ICC playing conditions of being useless. Apologies. But yeah, so if they are going to move to 5-day tests, my understanding was always that it was going to be between the two boards. But in fact, it seems
to get the ICC involved first.
Quite. So that's quite interesting.
Okay.
Now, Sid, there has been a lot of talk around should women's tests be 5 days. That's the kind of one of the big debates. What do you think about this?
I don't mind it in principle, but I don't particularly feel that it's a massive axe that it's worth grinding. I think what this test has shown is that if you play declaration cricket in the right way, in the smart way, if you use your head and you realise that as a captain you have some responsibility to balance the game, not even for the good of the game, but to allow yourself to win the game. Then you can make things work in 4 days. So I think that there's a lot of things that I'd rather be doing before I become too focused on that 5-day thing. So one of the things that I definitely rather get on board with, if you offer me the choice between them, is say, well, could we have a 5-day test in the Ashes, or could we have a test against South Africa next summer? Now I believe that it's been officially announced by the ECB's official spokesperson on announcing things, Alex Hartley, on Test Match Special, that there will be a test against South Africa next summer.
Exciting.
This was something that we'd heard rumours about, but we were like, okay, that's just something that we need to keep between ourselves. Yeah. But apparently, it's out there now. It's
out there.
And I think that is where we need to be kind of moving forwards and investing. And wouldn't it be brilliant if in 2 years' time New Zealand came in here, and maybe Susie and Sophie and that lot will still be playing, and they will finally get the test that they've longed for. Yeah. So that's where I think we should be focusing our efforts.
Yeah, I've got to say is that the wrong expression? I was going to say my mouth is watering at the thought of watching Sophie Devine or Laura Wolfart playing Test cricket.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, my concern has always been that if we mandate that women's tests are 5 days, I think I said this after Bristol, if we mandate that, then what we actually do is make it so that less women's tests take place. And I think that we can all agree that we'd rather see more women's tests of 4 days duration than less women's tests of 5 days duration.
Absolutely.
I do think that one of the really interesting things that seems to have happened kind of surrounding this test, partly because it has been such an exciting test and such a kind of amazing advert for women's test cricket, is that suddenly loads of people who really weren't very engaged with women's tests before have suddenly engaged with it and gone, oh, hang on, I didn't really think about this before, but actually, why aren't women playing more tests? And actually, why aren't they playing 5-day tests? They have no idea of the context, they don't really understand the reasons, they don't understand the difference, they don't really, they have never really thought about it before, but there seems to be an awful lot of people on Twitter suddenly waking up and going, oh, this is quite interesting, and I quite like men's test cricket, so hey, I'm going to support women's test cricket. Now that's interesting because one of the arguments of the administrators has been, oh, people aren't very interested in women's test cricket, and I really remember being quite cross during the 2017 test at North Sydney Oval when Belinda Clark was interviewed on air. I think we did a piece about it for CRICKETher, and she came out and she said, oh, women's test cricket, it just doesn't hold a place in people's hearts. It doesn't hold a place in people's hearts. And I think that we're really seeing that starting to shift now as a result of this test, and that's going to make it much harder for the administrators to continue to resist if there is this public push. So I think that's kind of interesting.
Okay. Now we've got some ODIs following very quickly on this. They start halfway through next week.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure it's Wednesday or Thursday our time or Australian time, or we've completely lost track. What are England going to take into the ODIs, Raf?
Well, I was just thinking what I'm going to take into the ODIs is, oh dear, I've got to go for more sleepless
Coffee.
nights. Yeah, coffee, hopefully. What are England going to take into the ODIs? Well, I think, and I did sort of talk about this in the piece that I wrote today, that I think that it's going to be quite difficult for England to pick themselves up psychologically. I think we heard Nat Sciver saying straight after play that she was feeling more sad about not having won than she was happy about not having lost, and I think that a lot of the England players feel like that. There was another interview with Heather Knight on TMS where she was crying on air, which isn't a very Heather Knight thing to do. It's more of a Heather Knight thing to do than it is a Meg Lanning thing to do, but even so, there's obviously an awful amount of energy that's been expended in trying to fight for the Ashes and trying to win this test, and now they've got another very quick turnaround to try and pick themselves up and go into these ODIs. So what are England going to take? Well, I think that they're going to be quite tired, and I hope that they're going to work on trying to kind of overcome this psychologically, but I think it's going to be quite tricky. What about the team, Sid? Is that going to change?
Oh, I think that undoubtedly there's got to be changes, hasn't they? They talked right at the beginning of the tour of an awareness of how they were going to have to rotate the bowlers. I mean, Catherine Brunt has, put her body through, quite a brutal experience in this test. And Anya Shrubsole's also bowled a fair number of overs, so I think there's a very, very strong chance that we're going to see them rested. We're likely to see Freya Davis. I think we're likely to see Tash Farrant play a role in the ODIs as well. Batting wise, I suspect Danny Wyatt comes back into the 11. And otherwise, I think the batting's probably unchanged. So just it'll be Wyatt for Lauren Winfield Hill. But the bowling, there's definitely going to be rotation going forward. Be interesting to see what they do with the spinners as well.
Yeah.
Are they going to give Sophie Eccleston a bit of a had to get through a fair number of overs. So yeah, rotation in the bowling, not too much change in the batting. Okay. What about Australia, Raf? There's been an announcement about their World Cup squad this week, hasn't there?
Yeah, they have announced their World Cup squad. It's quite exciting. It obviously looks very similar to the Ashes squad, but they've added in Amanda Jade Wellington. They've also got Grace Harris, who was in the T20 squad, but obviously the omission of Wellington from the Ashes squad was the big talking point. We talked about it at length on this podcast. I think I described it as total crap. So congratulations to the Australian selectors who appear to have seen sense. I think it's really exciting. And it's obviously partly been forced on them by Volemic's injury, putting her out of the World Cup, but it's a real opportunity for Amanda Jade, and I wish her well.
Do you think she might play in the ODIs?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Obviously, Australia A, and Wellington's been playing for Australia A against the England A team, so some of these players have been playing competitive cricket in a way that we wouldn't necessarily have seen in previous Women's Ashes tours. But I do think that if you're going to throw somebody in to play on your World Cup team, then you probably want to give them some experience playing in the main Ashes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously she's not officially in the squad, is she?
No.
But as far as we're aware, there's nothing to stop them playing her. And obviously England have been moving people back and forth between the two squads. So
yeah, we did talk about this before the series. We weren't 100% sure how it was going to work, but it's been quite obvious watching the TV coverage that the A squads, after they've played their games, are coming to watch the main players play. So there doesn't seem to be an awful amount of kind of enforcement of keeping them apart in the sense of totally.
Oh, totally not. No, Hannah Darlington's been playing for the A's and then coming and sitting on the bench in the Test
Exactly.
and being 12th in the Test. So, yeah. Right, and finally this week, the ECB have had an announcement that the schedule for the Women's 100 is out now, and there's going to be 2 less games per team than last year. Why is that, Raf, and what do we make of it?
Yeah, well, it's only for the women's 100, isn't it? The men's 100, it's still going to be 8 games per team, as it was for the women's 100 last year. And it's been forced on the ECB, essentially, by the schedule for the Commonwealth Games, which is running in late July and early August. So the men's 100 is going to start a bit earlier. And obviously the idea of the 100 is to run it during the summer holidays in August. So, yeah, they've tried to make it so that... Well, what they've essentially gone with, I think, is what you said in your piece. It's the least bad option, isn't it? Otherwise, the options were you play the 100 and you start playing it without any of the world's top players who are all playing in the Commonwealth Games, or you abandon trying to link it up with the men's altogether as well. I suppose that was a possibility, but they've tried to kind of get the best of both worlds, and they've gone with this whereby the women's 100 is going to be slightly truncated, meaning that the Commonwealth Games players can all play in it. And that there is still going to be a substantial number of double headers as well.
Yeah, so basically the men are going to play 2 rounds of fixtures and then the women will join in,
Yeah.
and from that point it'll be the double headers and then a final at Lords again.
Yeah, exactly.
So that means 2 domestic finals at Lords, with the Rachel Hayhoe Flint final also at Lords this year. So
very
lots to look forward
exciting.
to at the home of cricket.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we've got a domestic schedule and the women's 100 schedule now, and we don't have any international fixtures, and it's all very strange.
Apart from the South Africa Test.
Yeah, but we don't know when that's going to be. I don't know when they're going to fit it in.
Ask Alex Hartley.
Let's do it over the weekend.
Okay, well that's all for this week. Thank you very much for watching. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing the ODIs, and we will try to be as coherent as we can after another 3 days of sleepless nights. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Can I go to bed now?
Yes.